Before you deploy Azure NetApp Files volumes, you must identify the ADDS integration requirements for Azure NetApp Files to ensure that Azure NetApp Files is well connected to ADDS. Incorrect or incomplete ADDS integration with Azure NetApp Files might cause client access interruptions or outages for SMB, dual protocol, or Kerberos NFSv 4.1 volumes. One of the ways to ensure Azure NetApp Files is well connected to your ADDS systems is to create site and subnets for your domain controllers. If you plan to provision SMB, dual protocol, or Kerberos NFSv 4.1 volumes, then an ADDS site is required in order to configure an Azure NetApp Files Active Directory connection properly. The ADDS site name will be used by Azure NetApp Files for domain controller discovery. The default site name for ADDS is default first site name. Follow the naming conventions for site names if you want to rename the site name. Now let's talk about how to create a site in ADDS. In the Windows search box, type Active Directory Sites and Services, and select the ADDS app here. When the Active Directory Sites and Services window opens, in the left pane, right-click Sites and click on New Site. Give the new site a suitable name. Select Default IP Site Link and click OK. Clicking OK again when prompted. You now have created a new AD site. At this point, you can place Azure NetApp Files specific domain controllers inside of the newly created ADDS site. If you expand default first site name here and expand the servers folder, you will see all servers that are in the default first site name. By default, all domain controllers in ADDS will be under the default site. In a production environment, you may see that there are more than one server in the given amount of sites you have configured in your environment. Now we will have to link the domain controller to the site. If you right-click the server that you want to add the newly create site, then select Move. You will then have an option to select the appropriate site. Once selected, press OK, and the server is now under the newly created site. To mitigate any unintentional errors, please refrain from dragging servers into the site. Here are some key takeaways about site settings for Azure NetApp Files. First, in this demonstration, you will only create one site. However, it is best practice to configure a backup site for fault tolerance. Second, try to name your sites based on its physical construct, and that it adheres to a DDS site settings naming conventions. Visit link in the description that emphasizes a DDS site name requirements. See link in description to review ADDS site naming conventions. Thirdly, sites needs to be reachable falling into supported network topologies. In this demo, the Active Directory server I am using is available via Peered Virtual Network in Azure, which is a supported network topology. For a complete list of supported network topologies, review the Network Planning section in the Azure NetApp Files public documentation. See the Supported Network Topology documentation link in description. When there is a CRUD operation on an Azure NetApp Files volume, depending on the protocol, that operation may require Azure NetApp Files to query domain controllers, and if the sites are not reachable from Azure NetApp Files, CRUD operation will fail. Lastly, if you have more than one site, it is important to configure your AD connection with the site that holds the domain controller configured in your AD connection. Now let's move on to adding the newly created site to a subnet. A subnet specifies the site boundaries. It is important to note the implications of configuring the wrong subnet for the Azure NetApp Files specific site. This can cause the wrong site being used during validation. In the left pane, right-click Subnets and click New Subnet. Enter the address prefix using network prefix notation. I am using Azure Compute, which is in a 10.0.0.0 network with a CIDR notation of /24 subnet in Azure. I will specify the subnet of my VM in the prefix section using the CIDR notation. CIDR, classless interdomain routing, is a method for allocating IP addresses. It's the /x number, and that number determines how many IP addresses will be available in that subnet. For example, if you have a CIDR notation of /26, that subnet holds 64 IP addresses. Select a site object for this prefix. Note select site that includes the domain controller that is in your AD connection. I will go ahead and select the appropriate site and click OK. You now have created a new subnet and associated the appropriate site to that subnet. To verify that the new subnet object is assigned to the correct site, right-click the newly created subnet object and select Properties. The site field should show the newly created site object. Once you have created your site and subnet, go ahead and jot down the site name and input the site name into your Azure NetApp Files AD connection. For more information on Azure NetApp Files AD connection, see the link in the description.